The Life and Work of Eugène Delacroix. To the Editor of National Opinion. Sir, once more, and for the last time, I want to pay tribute to the genius of Eugène Delacroix. And I beg you to be good enough to find space in your paper for these few pages, where I shall endeavor to set down, as briefly as possible, the record of his talent, the reasons for his superiority, which, in my opinion, is not yet properly recognized, and finally, some anecdotes and some observations on his life and character. I had the good fortune, when still very young, as early as 1845 if I remember rightly, to have friendly contact with this great man, now dead. And in this relationship, where respect on my side and kindness on his did not exclude mutual confidence and familiarity, I was able to form at leisure extremely accurate notions not only on his method, but also on the most intimate qualities of his great soul. You will not expect me, sir, to embark here on a detailed analysis of the works of Delacroix, apart from the fact that each of us has done that according to his power, as and when the great painter showed the public the successive productions of his thought. The list of these is so long that, even allowing only a few lines to each of his major works, an analysis of this sort would well nigh fill a volume. Let it suffice for us to give a rapid summary. His monumental paintings cover the walls of the King's Salon at the House of Representatives, of the Library of the House of Representatives, of the Library of the Luxembourg Palace, of the Apollo Gallery at the Louvre, and of the Peace Room at City Hall. These decorative pieces include an enormous mass of allegorical, religious, and historical subjects, all of which belong to the highest spheres of human intelligence. As for his so-called easel pictures, his sketches, grisailles, watercolors, etc., the total reaches an approximate figure of 236. The great compositions exhibited at different salons number 77. I am taking these facts from the catalogue that Monsieur Théophile Silvestre published at the end of his excellent study of Eugène Delacroix in his book entitled Stories of Living Painters. I have myself tried more than once to draw up this enormous catalogue, but my patience was invariably exhausted by this unbelievable fecundity, and in the end I gave up the unequal struggle. If Monsieur Théophile Silvestre has made any mistakes, it can only be by omission. To my mind, sir, the important thing here is simply to look for the characteristic quality of Delacroix's genius, and to try and define it. To ask ourselves in what way he differs from his illustrious predecessors, whilst equaling them, and finally to show, insofar as the written word allows, the magical art thanks to which he succeeded in translating the spoken word into plastic images, more full of life and more appropriate than those of any other creator of the same profession. In short, to show what specialty Providence had entrusted to Eugène Delacroix in the historical development of painting. What is Delacroix? What was his role? And what his duty in this world? That is the first question we must examine. I shall be brief, and I aim to arrive at immediate conclusions. Flanders has Rubens. Italy has Raphael and Veronese. France has Lebrun, David, and Delacroix. A superficial mind may be shocked, at first sight, by my bracketing together these names, which stand for such different qualities and methods, but a more penetrating spiritual eye will see at once that there is, between them all, a common relationship, a kind of brotherhood or cousinage, stemming from their love of the great, the national, the immense, and the universal. A love that has always found expression in so-called decorative painting and in what are known as great machines. Many others, no doubt, have executed great machines, but those I have named did them in the manner most likely to leave an eternal mark in human memory. Which is the greatest of these men, so diverse in their greatness? Each of us is free to decide that as he pleases, according to whether by nature he is inclined to prefer the prolific, shining, almost jovial abundance of Rubens, or the soft majesty and eurythmic order of Raphael, the paradisal and land of afternoon colors of Veronese, the austere and intense severity of David, or the dramatic and quasi-literary fluency of Lebrun. None of these men can be replaced. They had a similar aim, but used different methods, drawn from their personal natures. Delacroix, the last comer, expressed with admirable vehemence and fervor what the others had conveyed only incompletely. In doing so, did he perhaps sacrifice other qualities, as his predecessors, for that matter, did before him? It may be so, but that is not the question that claims our attention. Many others besides me have taken care to emphasize the inevitable consequences of an essentially personal genius. And it could also well be, after all, that the finest expression of genius elsewhere than in purest heaven, here below in other words, where even perfection is imperfect, can be achieved only at the price of inevitable sacrifice. But come, sir, you will doubtless be saying, what then is this mysterious, indefinable something that Delacroix, to the great glory of our age, has communicated better than anyone else? The answer is the invisible, the impalpable, reverie, the nerves, the soul. And this he did, pray sir, take good note of this, without any means other than contour and color. He did it better than anyone you care to mention. He did it with the perfection of a consummate painter, with the rigor of a subtle writer, the eloquence of a passionate musician. It is one element in the diagnosis of the spiritual climate of our age, be it added, that the arts strive, if not to substitute for one another, at least to lend each other new power and strength by the help of their own. Delacroix is the most suggestive of all painters, the one whose works, even those chosen from amongst the minor or inferior ones, give the most food for thought, and recall to mind the greatest sum of poetic feelings and thought already experienced, but believed to have been engulfed forever in the night of time. The work of Delacroix sometimes seems to me to be like a mnemonic device of the greatness and the inborn passions of universal man. This peculiar and wholly new merit of Monsieur Delacroix, which enabled him to express simply by contour man's gesture, however violent, and to evoke with color alone what might be called the atmosphere of the human drama, or the spiritual mood of the creator. This quality, peculiar to him, has always drawn him the sympathy of all poets, and, if it were legitimate to draw a philosophic proof from a purely material phenomenon, I would ask you to notice, sir, that in the crowd that gathered to pay him the last honors, many more writers could be counted than painters. To put it crudely, the truth is that the latter have never fully understood him. And what, after all, is so surprising about that? Do we not know that the age of the Michelangelos, the Raphaels, the Leonardo da Vinci's, yes, and even of the Reynoldses, is long since past, and that the general intellectual level of artists has gone down markedly? Doubtless it would be unfair to look for philosophers, poets, and scientists amongst contemporary artists, but it would be legitimate to expect from them a greater degree of interest than they evince in religion, poetry, and the sciences. Beyond the walls of their studios, what do they know? What do they like? What do they want to express? Eugène Delacroix, on the other hand, was, as well as a painter devoted to his art, a man of general culture, in contrast to other modern artists, who are, for the most part, scarcely more than well-known or obscure daubers. Gloomy specialists, be they old or young, craftsmen pure and simple, some of them with the knack of producing academic figures, others fruit, others again cattle. Eugène Delacroix loved everything, could paint everything, and was capable of appreciating every kind of talent. His was a mind open to all ideas and to all impressions. He was the most eclectic and impartial lover of all experience. A great reader, that goes without saying. His readings from the poets left him with awe-inspiring visions, quickly achieving sharpness of outline, ready-made pictures, so to speak. However different he may have been from his master, Guérin, in his method and his colors, he inherited, from the great Republican and Imperial school, the love of the poets and an indefinably vigorous spirit of rivalry with the written word. David, Guérin, and Girodet set their minds aflame by contact with Homer, Virgil, Racine, and Ossian. Delacroix was the moving translator of Shakespeare, Dante, Byron, and Ariosto. There is an important similarity and a slight difference. But let us now, by your leave, Mr. Editor, go more deeply into what might be called the teaching of the master. Teaching that, for me, arises not only from the successive contemplation of all his works, and of several side by side, as one was able to enjoy them at the Universal Exhibition of 1855, but also from many a conversation I had with the artist himself. Delacroix was passionately in love with passion, and coldly determined to seek the means of expressing passion in the most visible manner. In this dual character, be it said in passing, we find the two distinguishing marks of the most substantial geniuses, extreme geniuses, scarcely created to please timorous souls who are easy to satisfy, and find adequate nourishment in flabby, soft, imperfect works. An immense thrust of passion, coupled with formidable willpower, such was the man. And he was fond of repeating, "Since I consider the impression communicated by nature to the artist as the most important thing to translate, is it not necessary that he should be forearmed with all the quickest means of translation? It is clear that, in his eyes, imagination was the most precious gift, the most important faculty, but that this faculty remained powerless and sterile if it did not have at its command a swift technical skill, capable of following the great despotic faculty in its impatient flight of fancy. There was certainly no need for him to stoke up the fires of his imagination, constantly at white heat, but he always found the day too short for the study of the technical means of expression. To that ceaseless preoccupation must be attributed his unremitting researches into color and the quality of colors, his interest in problems of chemistry, and his discussion with color manufacturers. In this matter, he comes close to Leonardo da Vinci, who was also prey to these obsessions. In spite of his admiration for the ardent phenomena of life, never can Eugène Delacroix be confused with that mob of vulgar artists and writers whose myopic intelligence shelters behind that vague and obscure word, realism. The first time I saw Monsieur Delacroix, in 1845, I believe it was, how the swift and voracious years flow away. We talked about many commonplace subjects. In other words, questions vast in scope and yet of the simplest. Nature, for example. At this point, sir, I shall, with your permission, quote a passage of my own. For a paraphrase would not be as good as the words I once wrote, almost under the master's dictation. Nature is but a dictionary, he was fond of saying. To understand clearly the full meaning implied in this remark, we must bear in mind the numerous and ordinary uses a dictionary is put to. We look up the meaning of words, the derivation of words, the etymology of words, and finally, we get from a dictionary all the component parts of sentences and ordered narrative. But no one has ever thought of a dictionary as a composition in the poetic sense of the word. Painters who obey imagination consult their dictionaries in search of elements that fit in with their conceptions. And even then, in arranging them with artistry, they give them a wholly new appearance. Those who have no imagination copy the dictionary, from which arises a very great vice, the vice of banality, to which are particularly exposed those painters whose specialty lies nearest to so-called inanimate nature. The landscape artists, for example, who regard it generally as a triumph if they can conceal their personalities. They contemplate so much that in the end they forget to feel and to think. Quoting, for this great painter, all the areas of art, of which one man selects this one, and another that one, as the most important, are, no more than the most humble handmaids of a unique and superior faculty. If a very neat execution is necessary, that is so that the dream may be very clearly translated. If it should be very quick, that is to ensure that nothing is lost of the extraordinary impression that accompanied the birth of the idea. If the artist should pay attention to the cleanness of his tools, that too is easily understood, since every precaution should be taken to ensure that the execution is nimble and decisive. In passing, be it added that never in my life did I see a palette so minutely and delicately prepared as Delacroix's. It looked like a bouquet of skillfully assorted flowers. In such a method, which is essentially logical, all the figures, their grouping in relation to each other, the landscape or interior that provides their background or horizon, their clothes, everything, in short, must serve to shed light on the general idea and wear its original color, its livery, so to speak. Just as a dream is bathed in its own appropriate atmosphere, so a conception, become composition, needs to have its being in a setting of color peculiar to itself, obviously a given tone will be attributed to some portion or other of the picture, and this then becomes the key, controlling all the others. Everyone knows that yellow, orange, and red inspire and represent ideas of joy, wealth, glory, and love. But there are thousands of yellow or red atmospheres, and all the other colors will be modified logically and in given proportions by the dominant atmosphere. The art of the colorist is evidently connected, in some respects, with mathematics and music. Yet its most delicate operations are the result of a sentiment, which long practice has brought to a degree of sureness that defeats description. It will be seen that this great law of overall harmony condemns many garish efforts and raw daubings, even though by the hand of the most illustrious painters. There are some paintings by Rubens that remind us not only of colored firework, but of several fireworks set off on the same ground. The bigger the picture, the broader must be the touches of color. That goes without saying, but the touches are better not worked into each other. They melt naturally together, at a given distance, by the law of sympathy that brought them together. In this way, color gains in energy and freshness. A good picture, faithful and worthy of the dreams that gave it birth, must be created like a world, just as the creation, as we see it, is the result of several creations, the earlier ones always being completed by the later. So a harmonically fashioned picture consists of a series of superimposed pictures, each fresh surface giving added reality to the dream, and raising it by 1 degree towards perfection. In complete contrast, I remember seeing, in the studios of Paul Delacroix and Horace Vernet, enormous canvases, not broadly sketched in, but begun piecemeal. In other words, completely finished in certain areas, whilst others existed only in a black and white outline. This sort of product could be compared to a purely manual type of work, to which is assigned the job of covering a given area in a given time, or to a long road divided into a large number of stages. As soon as one stage has been completed, that is the end of that. And when the road has been followed throughout its whole length, the artist is delivered of his picture. All these precepts are, of course, modified more or less by the different temperaments of the artists. But I am convinced that the foregoing is the surest method for men with rich imaginations. It follows that 2 great deviations from the method in question are proof that an abnormal and unjustified importance is being attributed to some secondary aspect of art. I am not afraid of its being said that it is absurd to imagine a single system of teaching being applied to a crowd of different individuals, for it is evident that systems of rhetoric and prosody are not arbitrarily invented forms of tyranny, but collections of rules demanded by the very structure of a man's spiritual being. Nor have systems of rhetoric and prosody ever prevented originality from showing itself clearly. The contrary, namely that they have helped the flowering of originality, would be infinitely truer. For the sake of brevity, I must omit a number of corollaries deriving from the main principle, which, so to speak, contains within itself the whole code of true aesthetics, and may be expressed as follows. The whole visible universe is nothing but a storehouse of images and signs, to which man's imagination will assign a place and relative value. It is a kind of pasture for the imagination to digest and transform. All the faculties of the human soul must be subordinated to the imagination, which puts them all under contribution at once. Just as a good knowledge of the dictionary does not necessarily imply a knowledge of the art of composition, and the art of composition itself does not imply the gift of universal imagination, So a good painter may well not be a great painter. But a great painter is of necessity a skillful painter, because a universal imagination comprises the understanding of all technical means and the desire to acquire them. From the ideas I have just explained to the best of my ability, and how many more things there would be to say, particularly on the areas of common ground between the arts and the similarities between their methods, it is evident that the immense group of artists, or, in other words, of men dedicated to artistic expression, may be divided into two very distinct camps. In one, we have those who call themselves realists, a word with a double meaning, and the sense of which is not precisely determined. To bring out more clearly their error, we will call them positivists. The positivist says, I want to represent things as they are, or as they would be, on the assumption that I did not exist. The universe without man. In the other camp, there are the imaginative ones who says, I want to illuminate things with my mind and cast its reflection on other minds. Although both these methods, which are diametrically opposed, may enhance or diminish any subject, from a religious scene to the most modest landscape, yet the imaginative man must usually have come to the fore in religious painting and in fantasy, whereas genre painting, so-called, and landscape must, on the face of it, have offered vast resources to lazy minds not easily simulated. Delacroix's imagination. Here was an imagination that never feared to scale the difficult heights of religion. Heaven belongs to it, just as hell does, and war, and Olympus, and pleasure. He surely is the archetype of the painter-poet. He surely is one of the rare elect, and the breath of his mind brings religion into its domain. His imagination, as fiercely bright as a mortuary chapel, is alight with every shade of flame and crimson. All the grief in the passion enthralls him. All the splendors in the church fill him with light. Onto his inspired canvases he pours blood, light, darkness by turns. I believe he would gladly add his own natural magnificence to the majesty of the gospel as an extra offering. I remember seeing a little Annunciation by Delacroix, where the angel, messenger to Mary, was not alone, but ceremoniously escorted by two other angels, and the impact of this heavenly company was powerful and full of charm. One of his early paintings, Christ with the olive trees, is suffused with feminine tenderness and poetic suavity. The suffering and the majesty which resound so loudly in religion always awaken an echo in his mind. And still more recently, with reference to the chapel of the holy angels at St. Sulpice, his last great work, so inanely criticized, I said, never, not even in the mercy of Trajan, not even in the entry of the Crusaders in Constantinople, has Delacroix displayed a sense of color more splendidly and more learnedly supernatural. Never has he executed a drawing more deliberately epic. I am well aware that some people, stonemasons no doubt, architects perhaps, have pronounced the word decadence with reference to this last work. This is the place for me to recall that the great masters, poets or painters, Hugo or Delacroix, are always several years ahead of their timid admirers. In relation to genius, the public are like a clock that is losing. Amongst perceptive people, who does not understand that the first picture by the master contained all the others in embryo? but that he should constantly perfect his natural gifts, that he should sharpen them with care, draw new effects from them, that he should himself drive his nature to the utmost, that is inevitable, inescapable, and praiseworthy. The principal feature of Delacroix's genius is precisely that it knows not decadence. It displays only progress. But his original qualities were so powerful and so rich, and they made such a vigorous impact on even the most commonplace minds, that the latter are insensitive to his daily progress. Only informed minds can perceive it clearly. I referred just now to the remarks of certain Masons. For me, the word describes that class of gross materialistic minds. Their number is legion, that take an appreciative interest in objects only by their contour, or worse still, on a three-dimensional basis: breadth, length, and depth, just as savages or peasants do. I have often heard people of that sort draw up a hierarchy of qualities, which was totally unintelligible to me. They would maintain, for example, that the faculty that enables this man to create an exact contour, or that man a contour of supernatural beauty, is superior to the faculty that can assemble colors in an enchanting manner. According to these people, color has no power to dream, to think, or speak. It would appear that when I contemplate the works of those men, especially known as colorists, I am giving myself up to a pleasure that is not of a noble kind. For 2 pence, they would stamp me as a materialist, reserving for themselves the aristocratic epithet of spiritualists. These shallow minds do not reflect that the two faculties can never be entirely separated, and that both are the result of an original seed carefully cultivated. External nature does no more than provide the artist with an ever-occurring chance of cultivating the seed. Nature is no more than an uncoordinated mass of material that the artist is invited to assemble and put in order. An incentive, an alarm clock for the slumbering faculties. To speak with precision, there is in nature neither line nor color. It is man that creates line and color. Both are abstractions drawing their equal dignity from the same origin. As a child, a draftsman born will see in nature, whether still or moving, a number of sinuous shapes from which he gets some pleasure, and which he enjoys recording by lines on paper, accentuating or reducing as the spirit moves him their inflections. In this way he learns how to produce curves, elegance, and character in drawing. Now let us imagine the case of a child destined to perfect that part of art called color. It is from the collusion or happy union of two tones and the pleasure he gets from it that he will derive the inexhaustible knowledge of tone combinations. In both cases, nature has acted exclusively as a stimulus. Both line and color arouse thought and induce reverie. The pleasures that flow from these are different in kind, but perfectly equal and absolutely independent of the subject of the picture. A picture by Delacroix, placed too far away for you to be able to assess the merits of the contours or the greater or lesser dramatic quality of the subject, offers, even at that distance, a supernatural pleasure. It is as though a magical atmosphere has moved towards you and is enveloping you. This impression, gloomy yet delightful, luminous but calm, and planted forever in your memory, is the proof of the genuine, the perfect colorist. Nor will the act of analyzing the subject when you come closer take anything away from this initial pleasure, or add anything to it, its source being elsewhere and far removed from any defined thought. I can reverse the example. A well-drawn figure inspires in you a pleasure that is quite foreign to the subject, be it voluptuous or frightening. This figure owes its charm exclusively to the pattern it describes in space. The limbs of a martyr being flayed alive, or the body of a nymph in a swoon, provided they are skillfully drawn, offer a species of pleasure in which the nature of the subject counts for nothing. If it were otherwise for you, you would oblige me to write you down as a torturer or an amorist. But alas, what is the good? What is the good of forever repeating these useless truths? Yet perhaps, sir, your readers will value all this rhetoric less than the details I am myself impatient to give them on the personality and the way of life of our lamented great painter. It is particularly in the writings of Eugène Delacroix that the duality of nature I was referring to emerges. Many people, as you yourself know, sir, were surprised at the wisdom of his written opinions and the moderation of his style, a matter of regret for some people, for others a reason for approval. Variations of the Beautiful, the studies on Poussin, Proudhon, and Charvet, and the other pieces published either in The Artist, which then belonged to Monsieur Ricourt, or even in the Review of the Two Worlds, only serve to confirm this dual character of great artists, which leads them, as critics, to praise and analyze with special relish the qualities which they stand in most need of as creative artists, and which are the antithesis of those they possess in abundance. If Eugène Delacroix had praised and commended the things we particularly admire in him, his violence, his decisive gesture, the tumultuousness of his composition, the magic of his color, that, in truth, would have been a good reason for astonishment. Why look for things we possess superabundantly? And how may we avoid the urge to extol the things that seem rarer to us and more difficult to acquire? We shall always see the same phenomenon emerge, Mr. Editor, in creative geniuses, whether painters or writers, every time they apply their faculties to criticism. At the time of the great struggle between the two schools, the classic and the romantic, the simpletons gaped in surprise when they heard Eugène Delacroix constantly vaunting Racine, La Fontaine, and Boileau. I know a poet naturally given to storm and stress, who goes into prolonged ecstasy over a line of Malherbe, symmetrical and musically foursquare. Moreover, however wise, sensible, and clearly defined in expression and intention the great painter's literary fragments may seem to us, it would be absurd for us to think they were written easily, and with the same sureness of attack as his brush displays. He was as confident of writing what he thought on canvas as he was worried at his inability to paint his thought on paper. The pen, he was fond of saying, is not my tool. I feel that I am thinking right, but the need for ordered argument, which I am forced to observe, puts me off. Would you believe it? But the fact of having to write a page of text gives me a migraine. This awkwardness, which comes from lack of practice, accounts for certain rather threadbare, rather pensive, and even First Empire expressions that fell too often from a pen otherwise distinguished. The most obviously characteristic features of Delacroix's style are conciseness, and a kind of intensity without ostentation, the usual type of thing arising from concentrating the whole of one's spiritual powers on a given point. The hero is he who is immovably centered, says Emerson, the transatlantic moralist, who may have the reputation of being the leader of the boring Bostonian school, but who nonetheless has a certain touch of Seneca about him, which can well be a spur to meditation. The hero is he who is immovably centered. The maxim that the leader of the American transcendentalism applies to the conduct of life and to the sphere of business may equally well be applied to the domain of poetry and art. One could just as well say, the hero of literature, the true writer, in other words, is he who is immovably centered. You will not, therefore, be surprised to learn, sir, that Delacroix had a very pronounced sympathy for concise and concentrated writers, those whose prose, little encumbered with ornaments of style, appears to imitate the quick movement of thought, and whose sentences have the decisiveness of a gesture. Montaigne, for example. I can give you a curious example of this fruitful and poetic brevity. No doubt you have read, as I have, a very interesting and very fine study by Monsieur Paul Saint Victor, which appeared recently in the press, on the ceiling of the Apollo Gallery. The various conceptions of the flood, the way the legends about the deluge should be interpreted, the inner meaning of the scenes and actions that go to make up the whole of this marvelous piece of painting. Nothing has been forgotten, and the painting itself is minutely described in that charming style, as witty as it is colorful, of which the author has given us so many examples. Yet the whole thing will leave only a formless shadow of itself in our memories, something like the very pale light of a photographic enlargement. Compare this lengthy passage with the following few lines, to my mind much more vigorous and more conducive to creating a mental picture, even if one were to suppose that the picture they sum up did not exist. I am simply giving what is said in the program distributed by Monsieur Delacroix to his friends when he invited them to come and see the work in question. Apollo, conqueror of the serpent Python. Mounted on his chariot, the god has already shot a number of his arrows. His sister Diana behind him, in full cry, offers him her quiver. The hideous reptile, bleeding from wounds already inflicted by the arrows of the god of heat and life, is seen in its death throes, writhing with impotent rage, and enveloped in a fiery haze. The waters of the deluge are beginning to recede, leaving the corpses of men and animals behind them on the mountain tops, or carrying them away. The gods are indignant at the sight of the earth delivered over to ill-shapen monsters, foul spawn of primeval slime. They have armed themselves, as Apollo has done. Minerva and Mercury are seen springing forth to exterminate them, that eternal wisdom may in time repeople the solitude of the universe. Hercules is crushing them with his club. Vulcan, the god of fire, is driving night and its fetid vapors before him, while Boreas and Zephyrs dry up the waters with their breath and scatter the remains of the clouds. The nymphs of the rivers and the streams have returned to their withy beds and their urn, still soiled with mire and debris. A number of shire divinities are watching from a distance the struggle between the gods and the elements. Meanwhile, from the highest heaven, victory is shown coming down to crown Apollo the victor. And Iris, messenger of the gods, unfurls in the soft air her veil, symbol of light's triumph over darkness and the rebellion of the waters. I know the reader will have to imagine a great deal and collaborate, so to speak, with the author of the explanatory note. But do you honestly think, sir, that my admiration for the painter has transformed me into a visionary in this case, and that I am wholly wrong in claiming to see here the traces of aristocratic habits, acquired by reading good books, and of that precision of thought which has enabled society folk, soldiers, adventurers, and even courtiers to write, with careless unconcern, mighty fine books, which we professional writers cannot help admiring? Eugène Delacroix was a strange mixture of skepticism, courtesy, dandyism, fiery will, guile, despotism, and withal of a species of particular kindness and restrained tenderness that always accompanies genius. His father belonged to that race of strong men, the last of whom we knew in our childhood. Some of them were fervent apostles of Jean-Jacques, others were convinced disciples of Voltaire, but all of them took part with equal determination in the French Revolution. And their survivors, the Jacobins or left-wing progressives, rallied in perfect good faith to the policies of Bonaparte. Eugène Delacroix always retained traces of this revolutionary background. It may be said of him, as of Stendhal, that he was frightened to death of being taken in. Skeptical and aristocratic as he was, his experience of passion and the supernatural came to him only through his enforced acquaintance with reverie. A hater of the masses, he thought of them only as iconoclasts. And the violence suffered at their hands by some of his own works in 1848 was scarcely calculated to convert him to the political sentimentality of our times. In his bearing, manners, and opinions, there was even something in him reminiscent of Victor Jacquemont. I know that the comparison is slightly unflattering, and I therefore intend it to be taken only with reserve. There was, in Jacquemont, a suggestion of a middle-class wit, with a chip on his shoulder, and a waggishness that was as ready to fool the priests of Brahma as those of Jesus Christ. Delacroix, guided by the good taste always inherent in genius, could never have stooped to such low tricks. My comparison, therefore, refers only to the spirit of cautiousness and moderation that marks them both. In the same way, the hereditary traits which the 18th century had left in his nature seem to be borrowed particularly from that class, as far removed from utopians as from madmen, the class of polite skeptics, the victors and survivors, who, generally, derived from Voltaire rather than Jean-Jacques. Thus, at first sight, Eugène Delacroix appeared simply as a man of enlightenment, in the best sense of the word, a perfect gentleman without prejudices and without passions. Only by cultivating his society more assiduously could one penetrate the veneer, and become aware of the deeper recesses of his soul. A man to whom he could more legitimately be compared, in his outward bearing and manners, is Monsieur Mérimée. He had the same apparent coldness, slightly affected, the same icy mantle covering modest sensitiveness, and an ardent passion for what is good and beautiful. Under the same simulated egoism was to be found the same devotion to personal friends and dearly held ideas. There was something of the recluse in Eugène Delacroix. That was the most precious side of his nature, the side entirely dedicated to giving pictorial form to his dreams and to the worship of his art. There was something in him of the society man, that part of him was destined to hide the other, and to allay any resentment it could cause. I believe it to have been one of the great preoccupations of his life to conceal the waves of anger welling up in his heart, and to appear not to be a man of genius. His spirit of domination, which was perfectly legitimate, inevitable moreover, had almost disappeared under the cloak of countless kindnesses. One could have compared him to the crater of a volcano, artistically hidden under a bouquet of flowers. Another point of resemblance with Stendhal was his liking for simple formulas, brief maxims, for the good conduct of life. Like all people whose liking for method is all the greater because their ardent and sensitive temperament seems to turn them away from it, Delacroix liked fashioning those little catechisms of practical morality, which nitwits and layabouts without an aim in life are likely to attribute disdainfully to Monsieur de la Police, but which genius does not despise, because genius is related to simplicity. Sound, strong, simple, hard maxims that are a breastplate and a shield for the man driven by genius into an everlasting battle. Need I tell you that the same spirit of unshakable and disdainful wisdom inspired the opinions of Monsieur Delacroix in political matters? He believed that nothing changes, although everything appears to change, and that certain climacteric periods in the history of nations invariably bring back analogous phenomena. In fact, his thought in this question came very close, especially in its aspect of cold and distressing resignation, to the thought of a historian I, for my part, have great respect for, and to whom you, sir, who are so familiar with these arguments and can appreciate talent even when it contradicts you, have surely been constrained to admire more than once. I refer to Monsieur Ferrari, the subtle and learned author of the History of Reason. Inevitably, any talker who, in the presence of Monsieur Delacroix, let himself go in childish utopian enthusiasms, very soon felt the effect of his bitter laugh, informed with sarcastic pity, and if, incautiously one were, in his hearing, to launch the grand chimera of modern times, the monster balloon of perfectibility and indefinite progress, he was fond of saying, "Where then are your Phidiases? Where are your Raphaels?" You may be sure, on the other hand, that Monsieur Delacroix's robust good sense in no way detracted from his charm of manner. This vigorous incredulity, this refusal to be taken in, gave a kind of Byronic flavor to his conversation, so full of poetry and color. He had also drawn from within himself much more than derived from his long experience of society. From himself, that is, his genius, and from the knowledge of his genius. A self-confidence, a wonderful ease of manner, and with them a politeness that emitted, like a prism, every shade from the most cordial bonhomie to the most irreproachable brush-off. He had a good 20 way of saying, "Monsieur, monsieur," in which a practiced ear could detect a remarkable scale of feelings. For after all, I must add, since the fact strikes me as another reason for praise, Eugène Delacroix, although a man of genius, or because he was a complete man of genius, had much of the dandy about him. He himself admitted that, in his youth, he had indulged with joy in all material vanities of dandyism, and, laughing at himself, but not without a suspicion of self-glorification, told how, with the help of his friend Bonington, he had worked hard to implant in the fashionable younger set the taste for English cut in footwear and clothes. This detail, I presume, will not seem out of place to you, For no memories are superfluous when we are portraying the nature of certain men. I have told you what particularly struck the attentive observer was the natural part of Delacroix's soul. In spite of the obscuring veil cast over it by our refined way of life, he was full of energy, but an energy that came from the nerves and the will. For physically, he was frail and delicate. The tiger, shadowing his prey, has less glint in his eyes and impatient twitching of his muscles than our great painter showed when his whole soul was pinpointed on an idea or wanted to take possession of a dream. The physical character of his features, his Peruvian or Malaysian complexion, his big dark eyes, which seemed to get smaller as they blinked in concentration, appeared to be sipping at the light. His mass of glossy hair, his obstinate brow, his tight lips, to which the constant tension of his will imparted a cruel expression. His whole person, in fact, conveyed the idea of an exotic origin. More than once, as I stood looking at him, there came into my mind a vision of the ancient rulers of Mexico, of Montezuma, whose hand, practiced in sacrificial rites, could dispatch, in the space of a single day, 3,000 human creatures on the pyramidal altar of the sun. Or one of the Hindu princes who, in the splendors of the most glorious festivals, have, in the depths of their eyes, a look of unsatisfied greed and an inexplicable nostalgia, something that might be the memory of things unknown and yearning for them. Pray note that the general tonality of Delacroix's paintings also conforms to the color appropriate to Eastern landscapes and interiors, and that it produces an impression analogous to that felt in tropical lands, where a vast diffusion of light creates, for the sensitive eye, a general effect that is quasi-crepuscular in spite of the intensity of local tones. The morality of his work, if in fact one may legitimately speak of morality in painting, also has a visible connection with Moloch. Nothing in his work that does not tell of desolation, massacres, fire. Everything bears witness against the everlasting and incorrigible barbarity of man. Cities set alight and smoking, murder and rape, children thrown under the horses' hooves, or stabbed by mothers unhinged with horror. The whole work, I repeat, is like a terrible hymn composed in honor of fate and inescapable grief. Sometimes he found it possible to apply his brush to the expression of tender and voluptuous feelings. For he certainly did not lack tenderness, but there too the incurable sense of bitterness was present in strong degree, whilst carefree joy, the usual companion of simple pleasure, was absent. Only once, I think, did he make a tentative incursion into drollery and buffoonery, and, as though he had guessed that to be beyond and beneath his nature, he never came back to it. I know a number of people who have the right to say odi profanum vulgus, but which of them can add triumphantly et archeo? I hate the vulgar crowd and keep at a distance. Handshakes, too freely given, debase the character. If ever a man had an ivory tower, well defended by bars and bolts, it was Eugène Delacroix. Who more than he has loved his ivory tower, his privacy, in other words? I believe he would willingly have armed it with a cannon and removed it to the depths of a forest or to the top of an inaccessible rock. Who more than he has loved his home, both sanctuary and den? Others may seek privacy for the sake of debauchery. He sought it for the sake of inspiration, and he indulged in veritable orgies of work. The one prudence in life is concentration. The one evil is dissipation, says the American philosopher we have already quoted. Monsieur Delacroix could have been the author of that maxim. In any case, he certainly practiced it with austerity. He was too much a man of society not to despise society, and the efforts he made to avoid being too visibly himself drove him naturally to enjoy our society most. Our does not imply merely the humble author of these lines, but also some others, young or old, journalists, poets, musicians, amongst whom he could freely relax and let himself go. In his delightful monograph study on Chopin, Liszt numbers Delacroix amongst the musician poet's most frequent visitors, and says that he loved to fall into deep reverie at the sound of that delicate and passionate music, which evokes a brightly colored bird hovering over the horrors of a bottomless pit. And so it came about that, owing to our very genuine admiration, we were admitted, though still very young at the time, into that well-guarded studio, where the temperature, despite our inclement climate, was equatorial, and where the first thing that struck the visitor's eye was the air of restrained solemnity, and that austerity peculiar to the old school. Exactly similar were the studios seen in our childhood of the former rivals of David, men of touching heroism, long since gone. To penetrate this retreat was to feel at once that it could not be the abode of a frivolous mind excited by 1,000 incoherent whims. No rusty armor, no Malayan kukris, no old Gothic ironwork, no trinkets, no old clothes, no bric-a-brac, nothing that reveals in its owner a liking for the latest trifle, or for wandering away in childish dreaming. A wonderful portrait by Jordaens, which he had unearthed heaven knows where. A few studies and a number of copies, done by the master himself, were all the decoration to be seen in this vast studio, where reigned a spirit of reflection, bathed in a soft, peaceful light. These copies will probably be seen at the sale of Delacroix's drawings and pictures, due to take place, so I am told, next January. He had two very distinct manners in copying. One, the free and broad, was compounded of fidelity and infidelity, and into it he put a great deal of himself. From this manner a bastard and delightful product emerged, throwing the mind into an agreeable state of uncertainty. It is in this paradoxical guise that I first saw a copy of the Miracles of Saint Benoit by Rubens. In his other manner, Delacroix becomes his model's most obedient and humble slave, and he achieved an exactness of imitation that those people may well doubt who have not seen these miracles. Such, for example, are the copies made of two heads by Raphael in the Louvre, where the expression, the style, and manner are imitated with such perfect naturalness that nothing could be easier than to take the originals for the translations, and vice versa. After a luncheon lighter than an Arab's, and having arranged the colors on his palette with as much care as a flower girl or a cloth bender, Delacroix would strive once more to recapture the interrupted flow of ideas. But before launching into his stormy work, he would often experience a feeling of languor, or of terror, or of exasperation that recalls the Pythoness fleeing the presence of the god, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau fritting his time away or tidying up papers and books for a whole hour before putting pen to paper. But once the fascination had gripped the artist, he would stop only when overcome by physical fatigue. One day, as we were discussing a matter of abiding interest to artists and writers, namely the tonic effect of work and the conduct of life, he said to me, "Years ago, when I was young, I could settle down to work only when I had some pleasure and prospect for the evening, some music or dancing or any other sort of entertainment. But nowadays, I am no longer like a schoolboy. I can work without ceasing and without any hope of reward. Moreover," he added, "if only you knew how broad-minded and easy to please hard work makes one when it comes to pleasures. The man who has filled his working day to his own satisfaction will be quite happy in the company of the local street porter, playing cards with him." This remark made me think of Machiavelli, playing at dice with the peasants. One day, a Sunday, I caught sight of Delacroix in the Louvre. With him was his old maid, the one who looked after him so devotedly, and served him for 30 years. He, the man of fashion, the dandy, the scholar, was not at all above showing and explaining the mysteries of Assyrian sculpture to this worthy woman, who, moreover, was listening to him with unaffected attention. The image of Machiavelli and the memory of my conversation years before at once came into my mind. The truth is that in his last years, all the things we commonly call pleasure had disappeared from his life. One pleasure only, harsh, demanding, terrible, had replaced them all. Work, which by then was no longer merely a passion, but could well have been called a craving. After devoting all the hours of daylight to painting, either in his studio or on the scaffoldings to which his big decorative work called him, Delacroix still found strength in his love of art, and he would have felt his day had been badly filled if the evening hours at his fireside had not been used, by the light of the lamp, to draw, to cover his paper with dreams, with projects, with figures he had chanced to catch a glimpse of in the daily round, sometimes to copy the drawings of other artists with temperaments wholly opposed to his, for he had a passion for notes and sketches, and used to busy himself with them wherever he might be. For quite a long time he had a habit of drawing at the houses of friends with whom he was spending the evening. That is how Monsieur Villot comes to own quite a number of excellent drawings from this prolific pen. He once said to a young man I know, "If you have not got the knack of making a sketch of a man who has thrown himself out of the window whilst he is falling from the 4th story to the ground, you will never be able to go in for the big stuff." I perceive in that colossal hyperbole the central preoccupation of his whole life, which, as is well known, was to execute a drawing with enough speed and enough exactness to let no particle evaporate of the action's intensity or of the idea's intensity. As many other people have been able to observe, Delacroix was fond of conversation. But the funny thing is that he was suspicious of conversation, as if it were a kind of debauchery, a sort of dissipation in which he ran the risk of wasting his strength. His first words when he went to see him at his studio were, "We won't have a talk this morning, if you agree, or else only a very short one." And then he would talk for 3 hours on end. His conversation was startling, subtle but full of facts, memories and anecdotes, in short, full of nourishment. When he was roused by contradiction, he would withdraw momentarily, and then, instead of delivering a frontal attack on his adversary, a maneuver that carries the danger of introducing the brutality of platform oratory into the skirmishes of the drawing room, he would sport for a while with his opponent, and then return to the attack with a whole lot of unexpected arguments and facts. It was the characteristic talk of a man delighting in conflict, but a slave to courtesy of a wily kind, yielding by design, full of unexpected ruses in flight and attack. In the intimacy of his studio, he would willingly let himself go, to the point of confiding his opinion about living painters, and it was particularly on these occasions that we often had a chance to admire the generosity of genius, which stems perhaps from a particular form of simplicity, or from a capacity to enjoy things easily. He had an astonishing weakness for decamps, much out of favor today, but who doubtless still reigned over Delacroix's mind by the power of memory. The same applies to Charvet. He once summoned me to his house for the express purpose of holding me over the coals about a disrespectful article I had been guilty of on that spoilt child of chauvinism. In vain did I try to explain that it was not the Charlotte of the earlier manner that I had been attacking, but the Charlotte of the later decadent period. Not the noble historian of Napoleon's veterans, but the tavern wit. I never succeeded in getting myself forgiven. He admired Ingres for certain parts of his work, and to be sure, he needed a powerful critical faculty to admire by force of reason what he must have rejected by temperament. He even went so far as to copy with care the photographs of some of those pencil portraits done with such minute delicacy, where the hard and penetrating talent of Monsieur Ingres, which gains in skill the more circumscribed it is to be seen at its best. The horrible color tones of Horace Vernet did not prevent Delacroix from feeling the artist's natural strength, which gives life to most of his pictures, and he used to find surprising expressions of praise for this bubbling and indefatigable energy. His admiration for Messionneur went a little too far. He had acquired almost by violence the preparatory drawings for the composition called The Barricade, the best picture by Messionneur, whose talent, moreover, expresses itself much more vigorously in pencil than with the brush. Of Messionneur he often used to say, as though thinking anxiously of the future, "After all, of all of us, he is the most certain to survive." Is it not strange to see the author of such great works casting an envious eye on someone who excels only in little ones? The only man whose name had the power to draw a few coarse epithets from those aristocratic lips was Paul Delacroix. For the works of that painter he could certainly find no excuse whatever, and he had an ineradicable recollection of what he had suffered at the sight of all that grimy, sour painting, done with ink and boot polish, as Théophile Gautier once said. But the man he liked to choose particularly for launching into lengthy discussions with was the man who was the least like him in talent as in ideas, his diametrically opposite, whose brain, though clouded by smoky skies of his native town, contains a host of admirable things. I refer to Monsieur Paul Chenavard. The abstruse theories of this painter-philosopher from Lyons made Delacroix smile, and the abstract principle-chasing pedagogue, on his side, looked upon the sensuous joys of pure painting as frivolous, not to say guilty things. But however distant from each other, and even because of that distance, they liked to come together, and, like two ships locked together by grappling irons, they could no longer part company. Both, moreover, being highly cultivated and endowed with great sociability, they met on the common ground of scholarship. That, as is well known, is not the quality for which artists usually shine. Chenavard was therefore for Delacroix a great standby. It was a real pleasure to see them fighting it out in harmless warfare. The words of the one tramping heavily along, like an elephant in full panoply of war. The words of the other as vibrant, as pointed and flexible as a fencing foil. In the last hours of his life, our great painter expressed the wish to shake his friendly gainsayer by the hand, but the latter was far away at the time. Sentimental and affected women may perhaps be shocked to learn that, like Michelangelo, pray recall the ending of one of his sonnets, "Sculpture, divine sculpture, thou art my only love." Delacroix had made of painting his unique muse, his mistress, his sole and sufficient pleasure. No doubt, woman had been a major preoccupation in the stormy hours of his youth. Who has not sacrificed too much at the altar of this dangerous idol? And who does not know that it is just those men who have served the idol best who complain of her most? But already, long before his end, he had cut women out of his life. Had he been a Muslim, he would perhaps not have driven her out of his mosque. But in his inability to understand what sort of dialogue she could have with Allah, he would have felt surprised to see her enter it. In this matter, as in many others, Oriental ideas were coming to take a lively and despotic hold of him. He looked upon woman as an object of art, delightful and made to excite the mind, but an unruly and disturbing object if we allow her to cross the threshold of our hearts, devouring greedily our time and strength. I remember once in some public place, as I was pointing out to him a woman's face of uncommon beauty and melancholy expression, he condescended to admire its beauty, but said to me, with that characteristic laugh of his, "How can you think that a woman could be melancholy?" thereby insinuating, no doubt, that women lack an essential something to be capable of experiencing the sentiment of melancholy. That, unfortunately, is a most unflattering theory, and for my part, I would not wish to commend opinions of a kind defamatory to a sex that has so often shown ardent virtues. But who will not agree that it is a theory full of caution, that talent cannot be too cautious in a world where booby traps abound, and that a man of genius has the privilege of holding certain opinions, provided they do not threaten public order, which would scandalize us in the citizen, pure and simple, or the ordinary father of a family. I must add, at the risk of casting a shadow over his memory, at least in the opinion of wistful souls, that he showed no greater tenderness for children either. In his mind, children always had jam on their fingers, which dirties canvases and paper, or were forever beating drums, which disturbs meditation, or were as incendiary and full of dangerous animal spirits as monkeys. I remember well, he used to sometimes say, that when I was a child, I was a little monster, The understanding of duty is acquired only very slowly, and only through suffering, punishment, and the developing exercise of reason does man diminish, little by little, his natural wickedness. Thus, by simple good sense, he was coming back towards the Catholic idea. For it may be said that children in general, and relatively to the grown man in general, are much closer to original sin. It was as though Delacroix had treasured up all his sensibility, which was manly and deep, for the austere feeling of friendship. There are some people who take easily to the first comer. Others allow the divine faculty to operate only on great occasions. The famous man I am speaking to you about with so much pleasure may not have liked being bothered with little things, but he could be helpful, courageous, ardent, when important matters were at stake. Those who have known him well have had numerous opportunities of appreciating his wholly English sense of loyalty, punctiliousness, and dependability in social relationships. If he was demanding towards others, he was no less strict with himself. It is only with sadness and ill humor that I come to say a few words of certain accusations leveled against Eugène Delacroix. I have heard people tax him with selfishness and even avarice. Pray note, sir, that this reproach is always made by innumerable hordes of mediocrities against those who take the trouble to administer their generosity with no less care than their friendship. Delacroix was very careful with his money. That was the only way for him to be very generous on occasion. I could give several examples of that, but I would hesitate to do it without his authority, and that of the people who have had good cause to be glad of him. Observe, too, that for many years his paintings fetched poor prices, and that his decorative works swallowed nearly the whole of his salary, when he was not actually out of pocket. He gave many proofs of his own disdain for money, when impecunious artists showed their desire to possess one or other of his works. Then, like physicians of a liberal and generous temper, who sometimes insist on being paid for their services and at other times give them for nothing, he would make a present of his pictures or let them go at a knockdown figure. And finally, sir, let us emphasize that the superior man, more than any other, has to take particular care to defend himself. It is no exaggeration to say that the whole of society is at war with him. More than once we have been able to see how true that is. His politeness is called coldness. His irony, however subdued, becomes spite. His economy, meanness. But if, on the other hand, the unfortunate man shows himself to be improvident, then, far from showing pity for him, society will say, "Serve him right. His penury is a punishment for his prodigality." I can confidently say that in matters of money and economy, Delacroix entirely shared Stendhal's opinion, which reconciled greatness with prudence. The intelligent man, the latter used to say, should apply himself to acquiring what is strictly necessary to avoid his having to depend on anybody. In Stendhal's day, this meant an annual income of 6,000 francs. But if, having achieved that degree of security, he wastes time in increasing his fortune, the man's a scoundrel. The pursuit of what is necessary, disdain for what is superfluous, that is the conduct of a wise man and a Stoic. One of the great preoccupations of our painter in his latter days was the thought of what posterity's verdict on him would be, and of the uncertain durability of his works. At one moment his lively imagination would catch fire at the thought of immortal glory, At another, he would speak bitterly of the fragility of canvases and colors. At other times again, he would refer with envy to the old masters, nearly all of whom had the luck to be translated by skillful engravers who had understood how to adapt their own needles and burins to the nature of the master's talent. And he ardently deplored the fact that he had not found his translator. This friability of the painted work of art, compared with the solidity of the printed work, was one of his habitual themes of conversation. When this man, who was so frail and so stubborn, so highly strung and so stout-hearted, this man, unique in the annals of European art, the sickly, the chilly artist, forever dreaming of covering great walls with his powerful conceptions, was carried off by one of those attacks of inflammation of the lungs of which he had an instinctive foreboding, we were all overcome with a feeling similar to the depression of the soul, to the growing sense of solitude, that the deaths of Chateaubriand and of Balzac had already made us feel, an experience quite recently renewed by the death of Vigny. There is, in a time of great national mourning, a lowering of the general vitality. A shadow comes over the intellect similar to a solar eclipse, that momentary imitation of the end of the world. I think, however, that this impression particularly comes to those who, in their exalted solitariness of soul, succeed in gathering a family about them only by their intellectual relationships. As for other citizens, they learn to know only slowly the great loss their country has suffered by the death of a great man, and the gap he has created by his going. Even then, they need telling. I thank you heartily, sir, for having allowed me to say freely all the things that were suggested to me by the memory of one of the rare geniuses of our unhappy age, both so poor and so rich, now too demanding, now over generous, and unjust too often.